The gunshot echoed through Copper Creek like thunder, sending birds scattering from their perches as Patience Keller ducked behind a water trough, her heart hammering in her chest. It was 1878, and the Montana Territory was no place for a woman alone, especially not one who'd just witnessed a murder. The dust hadn't even settled on her journey west before trouble found her. But Patience had never been one to run from danger, even when wisdom suggested otherwise. "You can come out now, miss," a deep voice called. "He won't be causing any more trouble." Patience peered cautiously over the edge of the trough. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the setting sun, rifle in hand, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Dust swirled around his boots as he approached, each step measured and deliberate. "I wasn't hiding," Patience replied, standing to her full height of 5 feet 4 inches. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins during her dive for cover, cascading down her shoulders. "I was merely taking a strategic position." The stranger's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. "Is that what they call it back east?" "Boston," she corrected, brushing dirt from her travel-worn skirt. "And you are Xavier Everett." He tipped his hat slightly. "Most folks call me Zav." "The bounty hunter?" Patience had heard whispers about him on the stagecoach, a man who tracked outlaws through the most unforgiving terrain, who never smiled, never drank, never showed mercy. A man whose heart, they said, had turned to stone years ago. The same. His eyes, startlingly blue against his sun-darkened skin, assessed her with cool detachment. "You shouldn't be out alone, Mississippi?" "Keller, Patience Keller. And I wasn't alone until my guide decided the contents of my purse were worth more than his word." She gestured toward the man now lying face down in the dirt. "I take it he was wanted?" Xavier nodded, securing his rifle to his saddle. 3 bank robberies and 2 murders in Colorado. There's a reward of $500 for Ben Hollister. "Well, that seems like a fair trade for nearly shooting me in the process," Patience remarked dryly. For a moment, Xavier looked genuinely startled. "Madam, I never miss. You were never in danger." The confidence in his voice wasn't arrogance, it was simple fact, and something about it sent a shiver down Patience's spine. "I'm heading into town," he said, mounting his horse with fluid grace. "You can ride with me, or you can stay here and take your chances with whatever other outlaws might be passing through." Patience sighed, looking at the lengthening shadows. She had little choice. "I suppose I should thank you for the offer." "Don't thank me yet," Xavier replied, extending his hand to pull her up behind him. "Copper Creek isn't exactly what you'd call civilized." As his powerful horse carried them toward the town visible in the distance, Patience couldn't help but notice the tension in Xavier's shoulders, the way he held himself apart even as she was forced to wrap her arms around his waist. It was as though he'd built walls not just around his heart, but around his very being. "What brings a Boston lady to Montana Territory?" he asked after they'd ridden in silence for several minutes. "My uncle died," Patience said simply. "He left me his newspaper, the Copper Creek Chronicle." Xavier's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Lady, this town eats newspapermen for breakfast. The last editor was run out of town after he published an article about cattle rustling. The one before that was shot." "Then it's fortunate I'm not a man," Patience replied calmly. "I've been writing for the Boston Herald for 3 years under a pen name. I know my business, Mr. Everett." "It's not your business I'm worried about," he muttered. "It's whether you'll live long enough to print your first edition." The town of Copper Creek appeared before them, a collection of wooden buildings straddling the main street, with smaller structures scattered like afterthoughts along rutted side roads. Despite the early evening hour, the saloon was already alive with piano music and raucous laughter. Xavier dismounted first, then helped Patience down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Patience saw something flicker in those blue depths, something quickly banished. "Hotel's there," he said, nodding toward a 2-story building with peeling paint. "Chronicle office is 2 doors down. Both are owned by Harold Murphy. He's greedy but honest enough." "You're not staying?" Patience asked, surprised to find herself reluctant to see him go. Xavier adjusted his hat, his expression unreadable. "Got to deliver Hollister to the sheriff. Then I'll be moving on." "Well, thank you for the escort, Mr. Everett." Patience extended her hand. "Perhaps our paths will cross again." His calloused fingers closed briefly around hers. "For your sake, Miss Keller, I hope not. People around me tend to find trouble." As he walked away, leading his horse with Hollister's body draped across it, Patience watched him go, unable to shake the feeling that Xavier Everett was a man running from something far more dangerous than outlaws, perhaps even from himself. Patience quickly discovered that running a newspaper in Copper Creek was nothing like writing for the Boston Herald. For one thing, the Chronicle's office was little more than a large room with an ancient printing press, a desk covered in dust, and walls that let in the wind through numerous cracks. For another, the previous issue, dated 3 months earlier, consisted of a single sheet announcing barn dances, cattle prices, and an advertisement for Murphy's General Store. "Not exactly hard-hitting journalism," she muttered, running her finger along the press's metal frame. "You must be Randall's niece," a voice said from the doorway. Patience turned to find a portly man with mutton chop whiskers observing her with undisguised curiosity. "I am. And you are?" "Harold Murphy." He stepped inside, his boots leaving muddy prints on the unswept floor. "Own half the businesses in town, including this building. Your uncle owed me 3 months' rent when he passed. I was under the impression the property was part of my inheritance," Patience said, reaching into her satchel for her uncle's letter. Murphy's laugh was dismissive. "Randall owned the press and the name. I own the building. $20 a month, due on the 1st. Patience swallowed her frustration. $20 was steep, especially considering the state of the place. "I'll need to see some documentation of this arrangement, Mr. Murphy." His eyes narrowed. "You calling me a liar, Miss Keller?" "Not at all. I'm simply conducting business in a businesslike manner." She smiled pleasantly. "I'm sure you understand." Murphy studied her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected." "I rarely am." Patience moved behind the desk, claiming it as her territory. "Now, I'd like to see those papers, and then perhaps you could direct me to someone who might help me clean this place up." By the end of her first week in Copper Creek, Patience had managed to get the Chronicle office into working order, hired a local boy named Tommy Wilson to help with the press, and written enough material for a 4-page edition. She'd also discovered that Xavier Everett hadn't left town as he'd indicated. She spotted him outside the sheriff's office one morning, deep in conversation with Sheriff Donovan. The 2 men seemed to be arguing, with Xavier repeatedly shaking his head while the sheriff gestured emphatically. Curiosity piqued, Patience crossed the street. "Good morning, gentlemen." Both men fell silent, turning to look at her with identical expressions of surprise. "Miss Keller," the sheriff nodded. "Settling in all right?" "Well enough, thank you." She turned her attention to Xavier. "Mr. Everett, I thought you'd be long gone by now." Something unreadable flickered across his face. "Plans changed. I've been trying to convince Mr. Everett to take on the role of deputy," Sheriff Donovan explained. "Town's growing, and with it, trouble. I can't be everywhere. And I've been explaining that I work alone," Xavier said firmly. "Always have." "A man can change," the sheriff argued. "Besides, winter's coming. Even bounty hunters need shelter when the snow flies." Xavier's jaw tightened. "I'll think about it." Sheriff Donovan sighed, clearly having heard this response before. Well, think quickly. I've got reports of rustlers hitting the north pastures, and I could use a man who knows how to track. With a nod to Patience, the sheriff retreated into his office, leaving her alone with Xavier. You're still here, she observed, studying him in the clear morning light. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. Observant as always, Miss Keller. His tone was dry, but lacked the edge it had carried during their first meeting. Horse through a shoe. By the time it was fixed, there was word of another bounty worth pursuing in the area. Patience raised an eyebrow. And that's the only reason? Xavier met her gaze directly. What other reason would there be? Before she could respond, Tommy came running up, his freckled face flushed with excitement. Miss Keller, got news for the paper. There was a fight at Caldwell's ranch. One of the hands was killed. Patience's journalistic instincts immediately took over. Who? How? Stabbed in the bunkhouse last night. They're saying it was Silas Reeves, but he's run off. Xavier's posture changed subtly, alert now. Silas Reeves. Tommy nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. Mean fellow with a scar across his cheek. I know him, Xavier said grimly. He's wanted in Wyoming for similar work. This sounds like exactly what the Chronicle needs, Patience declared. Tommy, run back and prepare the press. I'll go out to Caldwell's and get the full story. You'll do no such thing, Xavier said sharply. Reeves is dangerous. If he's still in the area, all the more reason to warn people through the paper. Patience countered. I'm going, Mr. Everett. You're welcome to accompany me if you're concerned, but you won't stop me. Their eyes locked in silent battle, neither willing to yield. Finally, Xavier cursed under his breath. Fine. Give me 10 minutes to saddle my horse. The ride to Caldwell's ranch took nearly an hour, during which Xavier maintained a vigilant silence, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape. Patience, however, had never been comfortable with quiet. Have you always been a bounty hunter? She asked as they crested a hill overlooking a vast expanse of grassland. Xavier's gaze remained on the horizon. No. When it became clear he wouldn't elaborate without prompting, Patience pressed on. What did you do before? A muscle in his jaw twitched. I fought in the war. After that, I was a Texas Ranger for a time. What made you leave? This earned her a sidelong glance. You ask a lot of questions. I'm a newspaper woman, Patience reminded him. It's my job to ask questions. And mine to ignore them when they get too personal, he replied, though there was less bite in his tone than his words suggested. They rode in silence for another mile before Xavier unexpectedly spoke again. My partner was killed, ambushed by a gang we'd been tracking. I got shot up pretty bad myself. Patience waited, sensing there was more to the story. When I recovered, I went after them. Outside the law. His voice was flat, emotionless. Got every last one. After that, there wasn't any going back to wearing a badge. I'm sorry about your partner, Patience said softly. Xavier's shoulders tensed. It was a long time ago, but it wasn't, not really. Patience could see the shadow of that loss still haunting him, keeping him isolated, preventing him from forming new connections that might one day cause him pain. She understood that kind of grief. She'd felt it when her parents died of influenza when she was 16, leaving her alone in the world until her uncle had taken her in. The Caldwell Ranch came into view, a sprawling operation with a large main house, several outbuildings, and a bunkhouse where the cowhands lived. Men were gathered outside, their expressions somber as Xavier and Patience approached. Jacob Caldwell himself met them in the yard, his weathered face grim beneath his gray mustache. Miss Keller, he acknowledged, then turned to Xavier with narrowed eyes. Everett. Caldwell. Xavier dismounted. Heard you had trouble. Mike Dawson, one of my best hands. Found him this morning with a knife in his chest. Patience slid from her horse, retrieving her notepad from her satchel. Mr. Caldwell, I'd like to include this story in the Chronicle's next edition. Would you mind answering a few questions? Caldwell looked uncertain. Not sure what good a newspaper story will do, miss. It will alert people to be on the lookout for Reeves, she explained. And it's important to have a record of what happened to Mike Dawson. Reeves didn't do it, a voice called from the group of ranch hands. A tall, lean man stepped forward. He and Mike were friends. They played cards together every Sunday. Xavier's expression sharpened. You're sure about that? The man nodded. Name's Luke Whitley. Been working here 5 years alongside both of them. Silas has a temper. Sure, but he wouldn't knife a friend in his sleep. Then why did he run? Patience asked, scribbling notes. Wouldn't you, if you were the obvious suspect? Luke countered. Silas is known for fighting. He's got a record. But this isn't his style. Xavier turned to Caldwell. Mind if I have a look at the bunkhouse? The rancher shrugged. Help yourself. Sheriff's already been and gone. As Xavier walked toward the bunkhouse, Patience continued interviewing the men, gathering details about Dawson and Reeves, their relationship, and the events of the previous night. By the time Xavier returned, his expression was troubled. Find anything? She asked quietly as they prepared to leave. Maybe. He helped her onto her horse. The killing wasn't done in anger. It was calculated, one clean strike to the heart while Dawson slept. Not the work of a man with a temper, Patience observed. Xavier shook his head. No, and there's something else. The knife was left in the wound. Meaning whoever did it wanted to make sure Reeves was blamed. A man doesn't leave his weapon behind unless he's trying to send a message. As they rode back to town, Patience couldn't help noticing that Xavier seemed more animated than she'd yet seen him. The investigation had awoken something in him, a sense of purpose beyond simply collecting bounties. You miss it, don't you? She asked suddenly. Being a lawman. Xavier's hands tightened on the reins. It's not that simple, isn't it? You're good at this, at finding the truth, at seeing what others miss. Finding truth and delivering justice aren't the same thing, Miss Keller. His voice had grown cold again. I learned that the hard way. Patience studied his profile, strong and unyielding in the afternoon light. Perhaps, but that doesn't mean you have to spend your life alone, Mr. Everett. His only response was to urge his horse faster, as if trying to outrun her words or perhaps the truth behind them. The Chronicle's first edition under Patience's management sold out within hours. Her account of Mike Dawson's murder, carefully written to suggest that Silas Reeves might not be the culprit, caused considerable discussion throughout Copper Creek. Some applauded her balanced reporting. Others, including Harold Murphy, criticized her for casting doubt on what seemed an open and shut case. You're stirring up trouble, Murphy warned her when he came to collect the rent. People don't like complications. People don't like injustice either, Patience countered. If Reeves is innocent, he deserves a chance to clear his name. Murphy snorted. That'll be difficult, seeing as they found him dead yesterday. Patience felt her blood run cold. What? Body turned up in Black Canyon. Shot in the back. Murphy seemed almost pleased to be delivering this news. Looks like someone delivered frontier justice after all. As soon as Murphy left, Patience locked up the office and headed straight for the sheriff's department. She found Xavier there, examining a map with Sheriff Donovan. Is it true? She demanded without preamble. About Silas Reeves? The men exchanged glances before the sheriff nodded. Found him early this morning. Been dead about a day. That settles it then, Xavier said grimly. Whoever killed Dawson also killed Reeves to silence him. Or someone who thought Reeves was guilty took matters into their own hands, the sheriff suggested. Xavier shook his head. The canyon's 10 miles from town. How would anyone know to look for him there unless they were tracking him? And if they were tracking him, why not bring him in for the reward? Patience watched this exchange with growing interest. You sound like you're officially involved in this investigation, Mr. Everett. The sheriff grinned. Meet my new deputy. Temporary, he added when Xavier scowled. Just until we solve these murders. I see. Patience couldn't help the small smile that curved her lips. Congratulations, Deputy Everett. Xavier muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, don't get used to it. Over the next few weeks, Xavier immersed himself in the investigation, often working from dawn until well after dark. Patience found herself increasingly drawn into his orbit, sometimes accompanying him to interview witnesses, other times simply providing a sounding board for his theories. Despite his initial reluctance, Xavier proved to be an exceptional lawman. His attention to detail, combined with an intuitive understanding of human nature, allowed him to see connections others missed. What surprised Patience most, however, was how the townspeople responded to him. Where once they had regarded him with wary respect tinged with fear, they now sought him out with their concerns. Women brought him pies. Men invited him to join their poker games. It was as though by pinning on the deputy's badge, Xavier had transformed from outsider to community member. The only person who seemed unaware of this transformation was Xavier himself. They trust you, Patience pointed out one evening as they shared supper at the hotel restaurant. It had become something of a habit for them to meet there to discuss the day's developments. The townspeople, they see you as one of their own now. Xavier cut into his steak with more force than necessary. They're mistaken. Are they? You've been here almost a month, Xavier. You've helped Mrs. Winters with her roof, taught Tommy how to shoot, even rescued Mrs. Peterson's cat from that tree. I'm doing my job, he insisted. Nothing more. Patience leaned forward, her green eyes intent on his face. Is it so terrible to belong somewhere? To let people care about you? Yes, he said harshly, then immediately regretted his tone when hurt flashed across her face. More quietly, he added, for me, it is. Because of your partner? Patience asked gently. Xavier set down his fork, his appetite gone. Because everyone I've ever cared about has ended up dead. My parents when I was 12. My brother in the war. My partner. He met her gaze directly. I won't risk that again. That's not living, Xavier. That's just existing. It's enough. But even as he said it, Xavier knew it was a lie. In the weeks since he'd arrived in Copper Creek, since he'd met Patience, he'd begun to feel things he'd thought long dead within him. Desires for connection, for companionship, for something more than the solitary existence he'd carved out for himself. And it terrified him. I should go, he said abruptly, throwing money on the table to cover their meal. Early start tomorrow. Patience watched him stride away, her heart aching for the walls he'd built around himself. She understood his fear perhaps better than he realized. After losing her parents, she too had been afraid to form attachments, to love fully and openly. It had taken years for her to realize that living in fear of loss was its own kind of death. What she couldn't yet determine was whether Xavier Everett was ready to learn the same lesson. The breakthrough in the case came unexpectedly, during what had begun as a routine visit to the Caldwell Ranch. Xavier and Patience had gone to follow up on some questions about Dawson's personal effects, which had finally been released by the sheriff's office. Most of it's still in his trunk, Caldwell told them, leading the way to a storage room attached to the bunkhouse. Nothing valuable, just clothes, some letters, odds and ends. Xavier knelt beside the simple wooden trunk, carefully examining its contents while Patience watched. He sorted through shirts and trousers, a tarnished pocket watch, a Bible, and a bundle of letters tied with string. "These are all from someone named Emma," Xavier noted, scanning the envelopes. "His sweetheart." Caldwell nodded. "They were to be married next spring. She lives over in Silver Creek with her folks." Xavier continued his methodical search, finally pulling out a small leather-bound book. "What's this?" "Looks like a journal," Patience observed, moving closer. Xavier opened it, flipping through pages filled with a neat, cramped handwriting. Suddenly, he stopped, his expression sharpening. "Listen to this. Saw something I shouldn't have today. W. Meeting with those men again by the North Creek. Same ones from last month. Something's not right." "W?" Patience asked. "Who would that be?" Xavier looked up at Caldwell. "Any of your men have a name starting with W?" The rancher thought for a moment. "Just Luke Whitley." Xavier and Patience exchanged glances, both remembering how Whitley had been quick to defend Reeves. "There's more," Xavier continued, turning the page. "Told W. I know what he's up to. Said if he doesn't stop, I'll go to the boss." He laughed, said I didn't know what I was talking about. "But I saw the cattle being moved. I know what rustling looks like." "Rustling?" Caldwell's face flushed with anger. "On my ranch? That's impossible. Is Whitley working today?" Xavier asked, closing the journal. "He's out with the herd," Caldwell replied. "Due back by sundown." Xavier stood. "We need to speak with him as soon as possible. And Mr. Caldwell, I'd appreciate if you kept this conversation between us for now." The rancher nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "You think Luke killed Mike? And Reeves too?" "We don't know yet," Patience said gently. "But we need to find out." They agreed to return later that evening to intercept Whitley when he came in from the range. As they rode back toward town, Xavier was uncharacteristically quiet, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you?" Patience finally asked. "That Whitley is part of a rustling operation, and he killed Dawson to keep him quiet." Xavier nodded. "And then killed Reeves to frame him. It fits. But rustling usually involves more than one person," Patience pointed out. "Who's he working with? That's what we need to find out." Xavier glanced at the position of the sun. "We have a few hours before we need to head back to Caldwell's. I want to check some sale records at the county office." Patience smiled. "I never thought I'd see the day when Xavier Everett voluntarily suggested paperwork." To her surprise, a small smile tugged at his lips. "There are a lot of things I never thought I'd do, Miss Keller." The way his eyes lingered on her face sent a flush of warmth through Patience's body. There had been moments like this over the past week's brief instances when the walls around Xavier seemed to lower, when something unspoken passed between them. But always, he would retreat behind his defenses before anything could come of it. This time, however, Xavier didn't look away. "Patience," he said, his voice rough. Whatever he might have said was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They turned to see Tommy Wilson galloping toward them, his young face flushed with excitement. "Deputy Everett. Miss Keller," he called as he reined in his horse. "Sheriff sent me to find you. There's been another murder." The victim was Harold Murphy, found behind his store with his throat cut. The brutal killing sent shockwaves through Copper Creek, not least because Murphy had been one of the town's most prominent citizens. "Doesn't fit our theory about Whitley," Xavier muttered as they examined the scene. "Murphy had nothing to do with the ranch or rustling." Sheriff Donovan shook his head grimly. "Maybe not, but someone wanted him dead bad enough to do this in broad daylight. Store was closed for lunch, but still risky." Patience circled the body, careful not to disturb anything. Was anything taken? Not from the store, Donovan replied. But his keys are missing. Xavier frowned. Keys to what? Everything. Murphy owned half the buildings in town, remember? He kept keys to all of them. Patience's eyes widened. Including the newspaper office. Xavier was on his feet immediately. We need to check it. Now. They rushed to the Chronicle, finding the door still locked. Xavier drew his revolver before inserting his own key given to him by Patience weeks earlier in case of emergency. The office appeared undisturbed at first glance. The press stood silent in the corner, papers neatly stacked on the desk, type organized in its cases. But Xavier moved methodically through the space, his experienced eye catching what Patience initially missed. The filing cabinet's been opened, he said, pointing to the slight disarray of folders. What do you keep in there? Patience hurried to check. Financial records, subscription lists, past editions. She paused, rifling through the contents with increasing concern. Xavier, my notes on the Dawson murder are missing. All of them. Everything including the information we hadn't published yet. Patience felt a chill run down her spine. Someone knows what we know. Xavier's expression hardened. And they're eliminating loose ends. Murphy must have seen something or known something. But what? Patience wondered. He wasn't connected to the ranch at all. A thought struck Xavier. The land records. You said Murphy owned half the town. What if the sound of breaking glass interrupted him as a bottle crashed through the window, trailing a burning rag? It shattered on the floor, flames immediately spreading across the wooden planks. Get out! Xavier shouted, grabbing Patience's arm. They stumbled into the street as smoke began billowing from the Chronicle office. People came running from all directions, forming a bucket brigade from the water trough to the burning building. Xavier spotted a figure disappearing around a corner and broke into a run. Xavier, wait! Patience called, but he was already in pursuit. The chase led through alleys and behind buildings, the fleeing figure always just ahead. Finally, they reached the edge of town, where the suspect mounted a waiting horse. As the rider turned to gallop away, Xavier got a clear look at his face. Luke Whitley. Xavier drew his pistol but hesitated. At this distance, on a moving horse, he risked hitting an innocent bystander. With a curse, he holstered his weapon and returned to the Chronicle, where the townspeople had managed to extinguish the fire before it consumed the entire building. Patience stood in the doorway, her face smudged with soot, surveying the damage. The press was intact, but much of her paperwork and supplies had been destroyed. It was Whitley, Xavier told her, keeping his voice low. He got away. We need to get to Caldwell's, Patience said immediately. If Whitley's running, he might go there first to cover his tracks. Sheriff Donovan joined them, his expression grim. Or to eliminate any other witnesses. I'll gather a posse. No time, Xavier argued. By the time you get men together, he could be long gone or worse. You can't go alone, the sheriff protested. He won't be alone, Patience declared, already moving toward the livery stable. I'm going with him. Xavier caught up to her as she was saddling her horse. Patience. This is too dangerous. This is my story, Xavier. Her green eyes flashed with determination. And Murphy died because of it. I'm coming. He recognized the stubborn set of her jaw and knew arguing would only waste precious time. Stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. No questions. They rode hard for Caldwell's ranch, arriving as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains. The place seemed unnaturally quiet, no men working in the yard. No smoke from the cookhouse chimney. Something's wrong, Xavier murmured, drawing his revolver. Stay close. They approached cautiously, tying their horses out of sight behind a storage shed. Xavier led the way to the main house, every sense alert for danger. The front door stood slightly ajar. "Mr. Caldwell?" Xavier called, pushing the door open wider with the barrel of his gun. No answer came. They moved inside, finding the house empty but undisturbed. No sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened to the occupants. "The bunkhouse," Patience suggested. As they crossed the yard, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood next to Xavier's head. He grabbed Patience, pulling her behind the water trough as more shots followed. 3 shooters, Xavier assessed, peering carefully around the edge. 1 in the barn, 1 by the corral, 1 in the bunkhouse. "Whitley?" Patience asked, her heart racing. "Can't tell." Xavier returned fire, forcing the shooter in the barn to duck back. "But whoever they are, they were waiting for us." A voice called out from the bunkhouse. "Throw out your guns and stand up with your hands high. Do it now or the girl dies first." Xavier's jaw tightened. "Stay down," he whispered to Patience. "When I create a diversion, run for the trees behind us." "I'm not leaving you," she hissed back. "This isn't a debate." His blue eyes blazed into hers. "I can't protect you and fight them at the same time." "You have 5 seconds," the voice shouted. 5, 4. Patience grabbed Xavier's arm. "There's another way. Let me talk to them." "What?" "No." 3, 2. "I'm coming out," Patience called before Xavier could stop her. "Don't shoot." "Patience, don't," Xavier began, but she was already standing, raising her hands. "I'm unarmed," she announced. "I'm just a newspaper woman. I want to hear your side of the story." There was a pause. Then the voice from the bunkhouse responded. "The woman can approach. Everett stays where he is." "No," Xavier growled, but Patience was already moving forward. "This is our chance," she whispered. "Trust me." Xavier had never felt more helpless as he watched Patience walk slowly across the yard. Her hands raised, back straight with a courage that both terrified and awed him. If anything happened to her. He couldn't complete the thought. In the weeks since he'd met Patience Keller, she had somehow become essential to him in a way no one had been for years. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He cared for her, deeply, and now she was walking into danger because of him. Patience reached the bunkhouse, where a man emerged to grab her arm roughly. Even from a distance, Xavier recognized him, not Luke Whitley, but Ben Hollister, the outlaw he'd supposedly delivered to the sheriff when he first arrived in Copper Creek. This was a trap, Xavier realized with dawning horror. From the beginning, the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Hollister hadn't been killed. He'd been working with someone in town, someone who wanted Xavier to stay, to become involved. Someone who needed access to his skills and reputation while setting him up to take a fall. Sheriff Donovan, Xavier breathed. The argument he'd witnessed that first day, it hadn't been Donovan trying to convince Xavier to stay. It had been a show for Patience's benefit. A new figure emerged from the barn, Donovan himself, rifle trained on Xavier's position. "You can come out now, Everett," the sheriff called. "Game's over." Slowly, Xavier stood, keeping his gun pointed at the ground but not relinquishing it. "Where's Caldwell?" "Dead, along with his men," Donovan replied casually. "Can't have witnesses." Xavier's gaze shifted to Patience, still held firmly by Hollister. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes meeting his with a message he couldn't quite decipher. "What's this about, Donovan?" Xavier demanded. "Rustling," the sheriff laughed. "That's just a side business. The real money's in land. Copper Creek's about to become very valuable, railroads coming through next year. We've been buying up properties one way or another. And Murphy wouldn't sell. Xavier guessed. Stubborn fool. Donovan spat. Would have made a fortune if he'd cooperated. So you killed him and stole his keys, Patience said, her voice steady despite her precarious position. But why burn the newspaper office? Because you two were getting too close. Whitley's voice came from the corral as he stepped into view. Finding Dawson's journal was bad luck. For you, Xavier agreed, his mind racing through possible escape scenarios. 3 armed men, Patience as a hostage, and at least 30 feet of open ground between them. The odds weren't good. Drop the gun, Everett, Donovan ordered, or Hollister will put a bullet in your lady friend. Xavier hesitated, his eyes locked with Patience's. To his surprise, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. I'm not his lady friend, Patience said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. I'm a reporter, and I want the full story. The Chronicle will need details if we're going to print the truth about how the railroad deal was corrupted by Copper Creek's own sheriff. Donovan frowned. What are you talking about? There's not going to be any story. Of course there will, Patience continued, her tone reasonable, almost conversational. This is exactly the kind of corruption the people deserve to know about. How their trusted sheriff betrayed them for money. Killed innocent people. It's sensational. Xavier watched in amazement as she kept talking, seemingly oblivious to the danger she was in. But then he noticed something. Hollister's grip on her had slackened slightly as he listened, confused by her lack of fear. Enough, Donovan snapped. Shut her up, Hollister. It was the opening Xavier needed. In one fluid motion, he raised his revolver and fired, hitting Hollister in the shoulder. The outlaw howled in pain, releasing Patience, who immediately dropped to the ground. Xavier's second shot caught Whitley in the leg as he tried to take aim. Donovan fired, the bullet whistling past Xavier's ear as he dove for better cover. Patience scrambled toward the bunkhouse, out of the line of fire. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire that seemed to last an eternity but was over in minutes. When the smoke cleared, Whitley lay motionless by the corral. Hollister was clutching his bleeding shoulder and cursing, and Donovan was pinned down behind a water barrel, out of ammunition. It's over, Donovan, Xavier called. Throw out your gun and stand up. For a moment it seemed the sheriff would comply. Then, with a desperate lunge, he broke for his horse tethered nearby. Xavier took careful aim and fired, the bullet striking Donovan in the back. The sheriff stumbled, falling face first into the dirt. Xavier approached cautiously, kicking away Donovan's dropped revolver before checking for signs of life. Finding none, he turned to secure Hollister, binding the outlaw's hands with rope from a nearby post. Patience? He called, fear gripping him when she didn't immediately appear. Here, she answered, emerging from the bunkhouse with a pale, shaken Jacob Caldwell. He's alive. They locked him in the storage room. Relief washed over Xavier, so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. In 3 long strides, he reached Patience, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Don't ever do that again, he murmured into her hair. Distract the bad guys so you can shoot them? She asked, her voice muffled against his chest. It worked rather well, I thought. Xavier pulled back to look at her, amazed that she could joke after what they'd just been through. But that was Patience, brave, resourceful, and utterly remarkable. You could have been killed, he said seriously. Her green eyes met his, unwavering. So could you. That's what happens when you care about someone, Xavier. You risk pain. It's part of being alive. The truth of her words struck him deeply. He had spent years running from connection, from the possibility of loss. But in doing so, he had denied himself the very thing that made life worth living. Come on, Patience said gently, seeming to understand the epiphany taking place within him. We need to get back to town. Let everyone know what happened. The aftermath of the shootout at Caldwell's ranch sent ripples through Copper Creek that would be felt for years to come. The full extent of Donovan's corruption was revealed, not just the rustling and land scheme, but years of taking bribes, falsifying records, and intimidating citizens. Hollister, facing multiple murder charges, eventually confessed everything in hopes of leniency. Patience's account in the Chronicle, which she managed to print despite the fire damage to her office, was picked up by newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco. Letters poured in from readers across the country, many offering support for the rebuilding of her office. Xavier, having fulfilled his temporary role as deputy, found himself at a crossroads. The new sheriff, elected in a special town meeting, had offered him a permanent position. The townspeople, grateful for his role in exposing Donovan, treated him as a hero, something that still made him deeply uncomfortable. "You should take the job," Patience told him one evening as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name. The early summer air was fragrant with wildflowers, the setting sun painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I don't know," Xavier replied, hands in his pockets. "Never planned to stay in one place this long. Plans change." Patience stopped, turning to face him. "Sometimes for the better." In the weeks since the confrontation at the ranch, something had shifted between them. The walls Xavier had built around his heart hadn't fallen completely, but they had cracked, allowing glimpses of the man beneath, a man capable of not just justice, but compassion. Not just strength, but tenderness. "What about you?" he asked. "The Chronicle's doing well. You've made a place for yourself here." Patience smiled. "I have. It turns out Copper Creek needed a newspaper woman more than Boston did." "And the town's new deputy?" Xavier's voice dropped lower. "Does it need him too?" "I can't speak for the town," Patience said softly, "but I know someone who does." Xavier took a step closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Patience," he began, then hesitated. The words he wanted to say stuck in his throat. Years of guarding his heart made vulnerability almost impossible. Understanding crossed her face. "It's all right, Xavier. I know it's not easy for you." "No," he said firmly. "It's not all right. You deserve better than half measures." Taking a deep breath, he continued, "I came to Copper Creek running from my past. I stayed because of a case. But if I accept the deputy position, it won't be for either of those reasons." "What will it be for?" Patience asked, though the hope in her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "For you," Xavier said simply. "Because somehow, without me noticing, you became the most important person in my life. Because the thought of riding away from here from you feels like cutting out a piece of myself." Tears welled in Patience's eyes. "I never thought I'd hear you say something like that." Xavier reached out, cupping her cheek in his calloused palm. "I never thought I'd feel it again. I believed that part of me was dead, that a man like me wasn't meant for." He struggled to find the words. "Love," Patience suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "I tried to fight it. Told myself it was dangerous for both of us. And now," Xavier's thumb traced the curve of her cheek, "now I think that some risks are worth taking. That loving someone doesn't have to mean losing them." "It doesn't," Patience agreed, leaning into his touch. "Sometimes it means finding parts of yourself you thought were lost forever." As the last rays of sunlight gilded her auburn hair, Xavier lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but deepened as Patience's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I never believed I could feel this way again," he confessed. You're the one that softened me, Patience. You brought me back to life. Patience smiled, her heart overflowing with joy. And you've given me a home, Xavier. Something I haven't had since my parents died. They walked back to town hand in hand, their future stretching before them like the vast Montana sky full of promise, adventure, and most importantly, love freely given and gratefully received. In the years that followed, Copper Creek flourished. The railroad did indeed come through, bringing new opportunities and growth. The Chronicle, under Patience's steady guidance, became one of the most respected newspapers in the territory. Xavier served as deputy for 2 years before being elected sheriff when his predecessor retired. They were married in the spring of 1880, a simple ceremony attended by the entire town. Tommy Wilson, now Patience's full-time assistant at the paper, served as best man. Jacob Caldwell, who had become a close friend, gave the bride away. Their home above the Chronicle office became known for its open door and warm hospitality. Xavier, once the most solitary of men, found himself surrounded by friends and, eventually, family. Their first child, a daughter they named Emma after Mike Dawson's lost love, arrived in 1881, followed by a son 2 years later. Visitors to Copper Creek often remarked on the unusual sight of the town sheriff walking his rounds with a newspaper tucked under his arm and a smile on his once stern face. Old-timers would tell newcomers the story of how Xavier Everett, the infamous bounty hunter with a heart of stone, had been transformed by the love of a courageous Boston newspaper woman who refused to believe that any heart was too hard for love. And on quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and their children were asleep, Xavier and Patience would sit on their porch overlooking the town they'd helped to save. Their hands intertwined, sharing the comfortable silence of two people who had found in each other not just love, but home.